had the idea of having an image of an electronic circuit, splitting it in half, and then engraving it onto 2 wedding rings. It would be a circuit that saves data, so it would be a metaphor for creating memories together. But I don't know circuits. I watched a video about someone making a circuit for saving 1 bit of data called a data latch. If we set the data to a value and then store it, the value at the end will be the same as what we set. If we change the data without storing it, the value at the end will not change. I applied what I learned to drawing a circuit with 2 data latches. The next step was to draw the circuit diagram. I watched an online tutorial for easy EDA, and I used Sebastian's video as a reference for how to draw the circuit. However, I didn't know how to figure out the details like what resistances the resistor should be or which components I needed, so I got some help with that. Next, I converted the circuit diagram into a PCB diagram. This version ended up being too small. If I shrank it down to fit on a ring, it would only show on a small part of the ring. So I elongated it, and this was the version I went with. I exported the image combining the top and bottom of the PCB. I also needed to process the image further, so I used Inkscape to do that. And this is what I ended up with. With the image, I could create a 3D model of each ring. I chose Blender to do that, and it was a bad idea. I am not a Blender expert, and I did not know what I was doing. Only part of the image cut into the ring. I couldn't round out the edges. Unexpected shapes appeared, like holes or lines that didn't curve the way I wanted them to. I spent weeks just trying to wrangle Blender into doing what I wanted it to do, but I couldn't quite figure out the right steps. Just as I was running out of ideas, my fiance suggested I try using Fusion 360. So I watched a tutorial, and I was able to figure out exactly what to do on the same day. I just needed to use the right tool for the job. Next, I prepared the models for 3D printing by importing the model into a slicer and adding supports. The slicer exports a file that tells the 3D printer what needs to be printed for each level. I used castable wax resin. I put the prints into a bath of 95% alcohol. Oop! At least I tried to. This resin does not need UV to cure it. Instead, compressed air was used to dry the prints. Next, I used flush cutters to remove the supports. Sometimes I wasn't careful pulling off the supports, and that left divots in the ring. One time I tried filing down the supports, but the dust that was created ended up in the engraving, and I couldn't clean it out. That impacted the clarity of the lines. The next big step was to create a mold around a wax structure. I used a soldering iron to melt wax sticks to build the wax structure. Please stick. Yes! I mixed up distilled water and a special powder to create the material that would become the mold. The mixture was put into a vacuum chamber where the bubbles were released. The mixture was poured onto the wax structure, and that was put into the vacuum chamber. The mold hardened and was put into the kiln. I prepared bronze casting grain for melting. The kiln heated up the flask, melting the wax structure, creating a cavity where metal can be poured in. The casting machine melted the grains of bronze into a pool of molten metal. The machine spun around, shooting the metal into the mold. After letting the metal cool down and harden, I quenched the flask in a bucket of cold water. And there it is! To clean it up, I used a toothbrush and various machines. I sanded, I filed, I sawed to clean up the supports and inner sprues. It was at this point when I realized my circuit was wrong. When I was following Sebastian's video, his chip had the connections input, input, output, input, input, output. But the chip in my diagram was different and called for input, input, output, output, input, input. That's okay though, because the image I made was an artistic rendering of a circuit. The 2 rings were still looking great. Back to removing the sprues. I tried using the sprue cutter, but the sprues were too big. So I had to saw it off instead. I left a huge nub that I had to sand down. I had to do so much sanding, and the rings got so hot that they got discolored. But the discolored metal ended up getting removed during the process of polishing them up. I used a drum sander, sanding sponge, and split mandrel at 400, 600, and 1500 grit. Time to take them to the polishing wheel. I prepared the polishing wheel by raking it to remove debris and applying polishing compound. Maybe a bit more. I put each ring on a holder. Oops! Remembering to push it in every so often. To clean them up, I put them in an ultrasonic cleaner and ran each under a steamer. Wait, why is it not turning on? Turns out I needed to wait like 45 minutes for it to warm up. I did the same thing again for a different polishing wheel and buffing compound. and they look amazing. I put some nail polish on to prevent tarnishing. After various failures, I made 2 unique wedding rings. You might be asking, why not do it in gold? Because that stuff is expensive!